So one of my very favorite poems is this little, 2,000 odd year old, uh, tiny, little lyric thing by Catullus. It's numbered as Carmen 11, and so it's a short poem, just a little longer than a sonnet maybe. And it's in stanzas though. I think it's in sapphics. I should look it up, but I am just rattling this off in the brief moment I have before my wife and daughter get back from a walk. So it's a little it's a little lyric. It is addressed to Furius and Aurelius, these two ostensible friends, and he sort of praises in lofty terms to begin the poem. And he says, I trust you more than I would trust anyone. And so I'm paraphrasing here. He says, I have something I want you, I have a message I want you to give to my ex-girlfriend. And this is where the poem has this wonderful pivot. So the second half of the poem is outrageously filthy, amazingly just foul, cruel, nasty, vicious, and shockingly sexually explicit. But it ends on a sort of a little a gentler sort of coda. But this little hinge phrase in the middle of the poem, where he goes from this very beneficent warm up to these two nominal friends, as he introduces the message he's about to deliver. The phrase he has is non bona dicta, to characterize the message that will follow. And non bona dicta in Latin, in my friend's translation of this poem, I think he uses the wonderful, simple understatement. He renders this phrase as, the words are not good. Non bona dicta, the words are not good. The words that I have, that I would like you to deliver verbatim to my old girl. So it's this sort of ultra simple statement that is so literal that that almost nobody would ever say it in conversation, but it conveys it conveys a lot of gruesomeness to come. And so if I have one little phrase, one little sentence to characterize what will follow in this week's episode, it would simply be this: non bona dicta. The words are not good. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. Lately, my older daughter has been into magic, like any healthy, normal 7-year-old. She asked me the other day, are curses real? My first instinct was to stall while I tried to remember the etymology of curse, which I couldn't do for, it turns out, actually pretty good reason, being namely that it doesn't exist. There is no etymology of curse. We don't know. We have some guesses, but we don't really know where it comes from. I did pivot quickly to malediction for evil speech or bad speech, but that was really just a distraction, which she identified quite immediately and repeated her question, but are curses real? So I had to think a little bit. My next response, also a typical dad response, was to say, it depends on what you mean by curses. which it does, but it was also not a very good answer. And so I had to chew a little bit. And, I thought, well, I know where her head is, I think, because it's exactly where my head, was, and would be at that age. We just moved from Grimm's fairy tales to Hans Christian Andersen's, about which I may have something to say on another date. There's some interesting differences there. She was reading Goosebumps, the R.L. Stine series. She was watching, spooky TV shows and movies, and this is something very much on her mind. I think when I thought about, mummies and vampires and amulets and purple smoke and radical physical transformations, that's what she had in mind. I was pretty sure, but I wasn't really satisfied with just debunking. Partly because I think that merely debunking interesting things that she reads about is not a very not even, it's not only not very interesting, but it's not, I think, necessarily a great way to teach my kid to think. So I stalled, but part of what came to mind while I was stalling was some ex-girlfriends of mine, a number of ex-girlfriends of mine, had related to me that they'd had little conversations that stuck with them. There were things that their mothers had said, specifically, in most cases, it was mothers. Things their mothers had said, often at a young age, usually in an offhand way, about marriage, about men, about love, about their bodies, their own bodies or the bodies of these girls. And this comment or this phrase or this, claim or whatever it was, oh, in that dress, you look like a Christmas tree, stuck. It caught like a hook. And they couldn't shake it. They couldn't get rid of it. And it had a corrosive or a venomous effect over time. It affected how they thought of themselves. It affected how they thought of their bodies. It wasn't exactly a malevolent, assault, but it was a word or a series of words that had caused a harm to them, lasting harm. And of course, it's not just ex-girlfriends and their moms. It was also, I thought of things I had said carelessly to them or to other friends of mine, or, good God, to students. Little jokes or evaluations, or often I think a comment about a kind of person, a sort of a third. I would say something carelessly about a group of people, a kind of person, men who don't tuck their shirts in, or something stupid like this, and unwittingly include my friend in this, or include the person I was speaking to in this category, or even if I didn't, leave an impression of something that they wouldn't want to be, lest they lose my favor, something like this. And I'm sure I have said and will say plenty more things of this kind to my daughters, my wife. I thought about what we call curse words today, words that are bad, ugly, inappropriate for mixed company, which even that phrase is a little bit off color today. Mostly traditionally, these are really just the Anglo-Saxon versions of perfectly polite Latinate words. But, those words, fuck, shit, piss, etc., those aren't really the curse words those words don't operate as curses the way that they used to. There are other words that do. There are slurs and insults that can cause real harm to people, and in just as real a way, they can cause harm to the speakers, particularly if they're said on the record. Similarly, there are speeches, a sentence, a tweet, a paragraph, an article that can take a man's career apart, and maybe rightly so, in the same way that his own speeches might. And And so when I thought about all of these different ways in which language, words, can cause harm, even the former chair of the department where I got my first MFA said, "This is," and I have to share. It's funny. I have enough distance from it that it's actually funny just because it's so fucked up. It's such a fucked up thing to say to a student. When I think about my own former students or my daughter, it's wow, it's a work of art. Really, what a prick that guy was. But he said, he said, listen, Matthew, in your life, people are going to tell you that you have a gift for narrative. I just want you to know that you don't. Which, as I said, is a really fucked up thing to say to your student. But even more so because I wasn't studying fiction with him. I wasn't telling stories with him. I was getting a master's in poetry. But boy, what he said to me, it stuck with me, and I can't get. It's in there. It has a kind of a curse-like power to it. So, what I said to my extremely patient daughter was the thing that I thought curses were when I was your age. That thing does not exist. But curses, words, or strings of words that can, in a moment, by virtue of being spoken, damage a person's life, sometimes permanently. Oh, that is really fucking real. Those absolutely exist. And that was my answer minus the fucking. That sent me back to my initial attempt to stall, which was to refer to maledictions, because as we have, language has become incredibly weighty. Seemingly casual speech has become incredibly weighty, and as it has in our public conversations, there is a kind of curse, the maledictory sort of curse, that has, I think we may have lost our appetite for it, or at least lost our feel for it. And this is a kind of speech that really does affect a change, that is performative in a somewhat meaningful way. And this is okay. So the malediction, as I mean it, is not a magical curse. It's not an implementation of cancel culture or whatever, however you want to think about that. It's not hate speech. Neither is it a presentational or competitive insult like you'd find in say the dozens. It's not just yo mama. The yo mama jokes are insulting, but they're really just sort of, it's a formula. It's an opportunity to demonstrate wit. The same is true in much of battle rap, right? It is a vehicle, a context, a framework for demonstrating verbal dexterity and wit. It's not maledictory in essence. The malediction I'm thinking of, that I want to spend some time today talking about, is really the deep and the long and the rich tradition of artfully, cunningly, poignantly saying, fuck you. Shortly after the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon, The Onion, the satirical newspaper, put out a curious long form article about the plane hijackers. The angle that this article took was that of a profile set in hell. That you know that interviewed interviewed the hijackers and presented their condition as they reoriented themselves, having undergone this laborious and horrifying process to perpetrate this enormous crime, all for the sake of entering an eternal paradise, only to find themselves in a perpetual inferno filled with unimaginable tortures and horrors. So I bring this up not because I think it was necessarily an especially good piece, or because I think it would date well. That I think almost certainly think it would not, particularly considering the contrast it highlighted between the 72 virgins, etc., expected by the hijackers, and the pretty grisly torments that the staff at the Onion dreamed up for them. And I certainly don't think it reads well in light of everything that came after the September 11th attacks. But I think that piece performed a certain function that is worth our attention. And when I said earlier that I thought we had lost our appetite for malediction, I certainly did not mean that we had lost our appetite for saying mean shit to each other. That we have not. We have an even stronger hunger than ever for brutalizing each other in words, especially online. But the difference, I think, is that we do it today with an implicit and sometimes explicit understanding that what we are doing is not just gratifying to us. It is not just that we are insulting our enemies or our opponents. Our understanding is that what we are doing is actually righteous. That we are speaking ill of those others over there, not just because we don't like them or because we happen to find ourselves on opposite ends of some disagreement, but because they are wrong and in fact they deserve it. And it is morally important that we type out these mean tweets. And I think that's, in an odd way, it sort of sours the whole experience. In the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche makes this claim that one of the major purposes, if not, I think he says even the primary purpose of justice, way back in the day, initially, early on, when man was sort of first forming societies, his claim is that the primary function of justice was not deterrence. It was not, correction of the perpetrator. It was not even restoration of the lost property or the lost life, what the Anglo-Saxons called the weregild, the man price. He says that the actual function of justice was to provide satisfaction to the injured party, and satisfaction typically in the form of a cruel and very physical, often permanent violence. so that the pound of flesh, um, so famous from the Merchant of Venice, I think he would say that is justice in its primal form. That the real good of justice is not that it gives you back what you lost, and it's not that it keeps other people from doing the bad thing, and it's not that it teaches the wrongdoer not to do wrong again. It's that it gives you the pleasure of inflicting harm on the person who has wronged you. And we recoil from that suggestion. I think we uh, um, rightly do not ask that of our justice system today explicitly. To be clear, I think the very last thing we need in this country is a more punitive justice system. To the contrary. But I think that in denying this impulse, denying this as a natural pleasure, I think in some ways, I think it can result in an even crueler response, because not only do we want that satisfaction, but we deny that we want it, and so we continue to pursue it in our justice system, in our discourse, but we insist that what we're doing, to go back to that Bill Coyle poem from a few episodes ago, we insist it's not just that what we're doing is something that we feel an urge to do or a need to do, it's that it's right. It's not just that it gives me pleasure to see you punished. It's that it's righteous that this should happen. And that's where I think the Onion article really performed a sort of an errand of compassion, because it didn't purport to make a case for the badness of the hijackers. It didn't purport to threaten revenge against the masterminds of the attacks. It really just offered a lyric sort of catharsis for readers. It allowed Americans to experience in print something that, of course, they could never and should never experience in real life. And by acknowledging that desire, by acknowledging that it did give us some pleasure in imagining torments for these people, I think it actually it is there's the possibility, at least, that is a kind of there's a possibility for compassion there. I'm very hesitant to assign a civic value to art and poetry, but I do think that there is something far more compassionate about acknowledging that that imagining violence, imagining horrible punishment for those who've done you wrong, gives you some pleasure. I think there's some value in acknowledging that, rather than insisting that no, it would be wrong to take pleasure in that. But it is right that this happened. It is important that this happened. I think there's a real, I think there's something really out of place there. And what I thought of all of this again years after that, when Obama announced that the U.S. had killed Osama bin Laden. There were two responses that I noticed, two public responses that I noticed that night, both in the in my immediate vicinity and on television and the internet. And one was a sort of theatrically patriotic, presentational, patriotic, cheerleading for the special forces. This was, a lot of often young men went out on the street to cheer on SEAL Team 6 and chant USA, USA into the night sky. And that response is pretty gross. I think it's fair to say. It's not an appealing or admirable response. But the other response that I noted was also felt very tone deaf. It was a sort of finger wagging insistence that one should never celebrate the death of a man. That it's unthinkable that we should express pleasure at the death of this human being. I hesitate to celebrate anybody's death, especially especially a killing as this was. But it's crazy. It's bananas to suggest that you can't understand why people felt some relief or some satisfaction when bin Laden was killed. It's crazy. This is a man whose name was known. The overwhelming majority of Americans learned this man's name in the same sentence in which they learned that he had murdered 3,000 Americans. This was the only knowledge most Americans had of this man, was that he was someone that they should wish dead. So of course, there was an expression of a sort of a sigh of relief, if nothing else. But again, the hooting Harvard jocks on the lawn, that's that feels equally out of step. It wasn't for several more years after that I read the Odes of Horace. But when I did, I got to it was Ode 137. It's book 1, Ode 37. And on reading it, I immediately thought back both to that night of bin Laden's death and to that Onion piece, years before that. And that's because Horace wrote this poem 2,000 odd years ago, not long after Catullus was writing his poems. Horace wrote this poem on the occasion of the death of an infamous, widely hated enemy of the state of Rome, who, after various betrayals and humiliations, had finally, at long last, been vanquished by the Roman military. And there was a great public expression of pleasure at this death. And the enemy of the state that I'm speaking of course, is Cleopatra. I'll just read you the poem as I read it. This is in David Ferry's wonderful translation. He did the whole book of the Odes, and it's one of my very favorite books. It's a book I come back to again and again and again, the Odes of Horace, translated by David Ferry. But this is Ode 137, which he just titles Cleopatra. At last the day has come for celebration, for dancing and for drinking, bringing out the couches with their images of gods adorned in preparation for the feast. Before today, it would have been wrong to call for the festive cacumen wine from the vintage bins. It would have been wrong while that besotted queen, with her vile gang of sick, polluted creatures, crazed with hope and drunk with her past successes, was planning the death and destruction of the empire. But, comrades, she came to and sobered up when not one ship almost of all her fleet escaped unburned. And Caesar saw to it that she was restored from madness to a state of realistic terror, the way a hawk chases a frightened dove, or as a hunter chases a hare across the snowy steppes. His galleys chased this fleeing queen, intending to put the monster prodigy into chains and bring her back to Rome. But she desired a nobler fate than that. She did not seek to hide her remnant fleet in a secret harbor, nor did she, like a woman, quail with fear at the thought of what it is the dagger does. She grew more fierce as she beheld her death. Bravely, as if unmoved, she looked upon the ruins of her palace, bravely reached out and touched the poisoned snakes and picked them up and handled them and held them to her so her heart might drink its fill of their black venom. In truth, no abject woman she scorned in triumph to be brought in galleys unqueened across the seas to Rome to be a show. Well, Horace is a master of the malediction, and that is a famous one because of its remarkable turn from really egging on the crowd in their hatred of Cleopatra to this strange sort of eulogy for her. You know, the Roman vision of war and of social order is pretty misogynistic, and you know it was especially galling to them to be defied by a female monarch, and it would have been very gratifying to them to do what they liked to do with the rulers of their defeated enemies, which was to put them in chains and to march them through the city in a triumph. And she knew that, at least in Horace's version, and you know he more than once says that she was unwomanly. She did not behave like a woman. He's praising her in a very Roman way. And in fact, when she sees that she could not live, you know, freely or on the terms of, you know, of her own choosing, she made an extremely Roman choice. You know, she's very much like Cato in this moment, and commits suicide on her own conditions and her own way, with you know that you know final badge of Roman honor, which is the forward-facing wounds on her chest, not on her back. So it's I think, though, it would be simplistic to suggest that the whole poem is just a bait and switch. It would be simplistic to suggest that, you know, this is a poem that reels you in by thinking that it's really it's for the, you know, the hooting dudes on the lawn chanting USA, when really it's observing Riley that, you know, Cleopatra was a formidable and honorable enemy. I think it is it's doing both things at the same time. I think, you know, when he acknowledges the Roman need to celebrate this victory, I don't think he's doing it sarcastically. I think that's very real. But I think, you know, being the poet he was, and also being the loser that he was, you know, because Horace, who was the son of a freed slave, as a young man, he joined the army of Brutus, which, you know, turned out to be a bad bet, and fought poorly in war, not very honorably. He, according to his own account, he basically turned tail and dropped his shield and ran. But the army of Brutus was defeated, and as a result of his joining up, not only, you know, was all of his property confiscated, but all of his family's property was confiscated by the state as a punishment. So he knew what it was like to be, on the losing side of the Roman legion. So I think both impulses, both feelings are true. And because it is a lyric poem, because it's a poem that's really capturing and conveying a feeling rather than making a sort of a political or moral argument, there isn't really a contradiction. Both of those feelings are true. The same thing happens in one of his other famous maledictions, cursing very comically the man who planted the tree that fell down and nearly brained him out on his farm. And he curses very athletically this man. But then he imagines himself descending into the underworld. And there in the underworld, he imagines all of the torments of the dead in Tartarus growing still for a moment as all of the shades listen to the deathless songs of Sappho and Alcaeus, Sappho and Alcaeus in the underworld. So there's, it's not that, again, it's not a bait and switch. It's that both of those seemingly conflicting feelings are true at once. That this is a genuine expression of ambivalence. So the structure of this episode is a little bit fucked up this week, for which I apologize. Partly because I recorded some weeks ago an interview. It was meant to be an episode. But there's a little bit of a snafu, and I had to shelve that for now, at least. While I'm putting this episode together, I'm also preparing another interview, which I fingers crossed should be coming out soon enough for you. But I'm doubling up so that I don't get caught flat-footed again. So I would rather have too much material in the can than not enough. So I'm a little bit disorganized this week, but there's so much good maledictory material and not nearly enough time. If this were a higher effort, higher quality podcast, I might give a more in-depth treatment of pop cultural maledictions, like say Ben Folds' Song for the Dumped, or really, if you want the sweet spot of the malediction is the breakup song. Catullus is not the only one. CeeLo Green had a song that was, I think the non-radio edit was just called "Fuck You," maybe 10 years ago. About the Catullus poem, by the way, the reason I am not reading it on air is I had a conversation with Ryan Wilson, who translated it, and he has not published that translation. I think partly for the reason that he said today over the phone. He said, I wouldn't want to be blamed for Catullus, which is maybe understandable. It is as I said, it is pretty strong medicine, but maybe someday, if this podcast survives and I start a Patreon, maybe someday I'll do a recording and a discussion of it for that, but not tonight. Tonight I will read another malediction that Ryan actually sent me that I had never heard of, that I think is quite good. Another breakup malediction. This is Heather McHugh. This is the only version that he or I could find online is from a collection that's just called Poems 1968 to 1993. So I'm not sure if it originally appeared in a magazine before that, but this is called Earth Moving Malediction. I'm going to read this and it's maybe say a word or two, and then I have a little closing segment that I think will be fun. So this is Earth Moving Malediction by Heather McHugh. Bulldoze the bed where we made love. Bulldoze the goddamn room. Let rubble be our evidence and wreck our home. I can't give touching up by inches, can't give beating up by heart. So set the comforter on fire and turn the dirt to some advantage. Palaces of pigweed, treasuries of turd. The fist will vindicate the hand. The tooth and nail refuse to burn. And I must not look back, as Mrs. Lot was named for such a little something in a cemetery or a man. Bulldoze the coupled ploys away, the cute exclusives in the social mall. We dwell on earth, where beds are brown, where swoops are fell. Bulldoze it all, up to the pearly gates. If paradise comes down, there is no other hell. So, in some ways, it's sort of a straightforward poem. It is like the Fenton Johnson poem I read, I think, in episode 3, like the Funeral Blues, like Everett Maddox's Anonymous. It's pluck the stars out of the heaven, burn the whole thing down. Sort of a Book of Revelation vision of the end of a marriage. Some little nice touches. I think it kind of plays with the quatrain form. That's how the poem is set up on the page until you get to the antepenultimate and penultimate stanzas are in tercets, and then the last one is just 2 lines together. It's not really a couplet because it doesn't rhyme, but initially it's quatrains, and there's sort of a gesture of rhyme and meter, but it swiftly breaks down. And the poem is sort of 2 things that keep coming up in the poem, I think, are the received phrases, the beating of the heart, tooth and nail, the fell swoop, the pearly gates. So I think there are a number of kind of received phrases or received language, and then it tends to get jumbled up and put out of order. The line breaks are very severe in the poem, and as in the sentence, I can't give touching up by inches, can't give beating up by heart. Depending on where you pause, the whole sense of that line can be hard to follow, because she's taking these received manners of speaking and jumbling them. You can see, the whole life almost, and the language of the quotidian language of daily life shared with somebody over years together, just getting crushed and piled up as the heap of shit at the front end of a bulldozer does. So that's that is how I experience it. And again, mostly it's just driven by anger. But I think there is plenty of venom and resentment. But it's a poem of heartbreak. It's certainly very angry, and it doesn't. The offstage man in it doesn't come off very well. But again, the point of this poem is not to attack, right? It's to vent. It's to give voice to an experience. This experience of wanting your fucking satisfaction and not being able to get it, and being willing to bring the heavens down on your own head, just for spite, because you were so furious and hopeless and sad, which is based on all of my secondhand experience of divorce, pretty pretty on the nose. So there's another poem. I don't know if I really have time. So Yeats has this famous poem, No Second Troy, which is directed to Maud Gonne, whom he obsessed over and wrote many poems about for decades and decades. And he writes this poem, No Second Troy. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great. He in a barely concealed sneer asks sort of semi-rhetorical questions about this woman, whom he compares finally to Helen of Troy. Both because she was very beautiful and because her self-indulgence in his mind, would have destroyed a state. He had a lot of ambivalence about the fight for Irish independence before, during, and after. But she, I think, had a less complicated view of it, at least as depicted in his poems. But I mention that one mostly because there's another poem written much more recently that it was by a sort of a former teacher and a friend, Mary Jo Salter. She wrote this poem, No Second Try, after her own divorce. So I think it was published originally in Subtropics, and then it was reprinted in her collection in 2013 called Nothing by Design. But it's not just a sort of Anthony Hecht has the Dover bitch as a response to Dover Beach, which is a at best kind of a smirky joke. I think Mary Jo Salter's No Second Try is a little bit more than that, and I even think that it uses the parodic conceit advisedly. So I'll quickly read that because again, I am going to run out of time, but it's too good to ignore entirely. Partly, and I don't have time to go through it all, but she preserves throughout. She doesn't preserve all of the end words of the original No Second Troy, but she preserves the end rhyme, the rhyme sounds of the original perfectly from start to finish. So it's an extremely close parody of Yeats' sonnet. This is No Second Try by Mary Jo Salter. Why should I blame him that he filled his days with mistresses, or that he came home late, to meet most ignorant trust with smiling ways? Such thoughtful gifts and claims that I looked great, whatever that meant, though clearly not desire. What help if I'd been wiser, with a mind simply to hurl his laundry in the fire, rather than buy his tall tales with a kind solicitude and a deluded kiss, having cleaned his house from stem to stern? Why, who else could he use, a guy like this? Was there another wife for him to spurn? Now, the famous last line of Yeats's poem, No Second Troy, is the last two lines are, why, what could she have done, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn? This is, completing his comparison of Maud Gonne to Helen. And here, I think Mary Jo does something different. She's taking up this famous, celebrated Yeats poem that uses this classical conceit, this high epic classical conceit, and she copies it very closely. It's worth noting that her former husband was himself a celebrated poet, so I think it's not accidental that there is a kind of a deflating effect in imitating Yeats here. That whereas, Maud Gunn being Helen, effectively Helen, suffered for, not having another Troy to burn. And so she had to destroy, Yeats's life and the lives of all these others around her. Whereas in Mary Jo's poem, No Second Try, the stakes drop drastically. It almost feels like a mock epic. You think of Thomas Gray's kitten drowning in the fishbowl, where it's not that there's no Troy to burn. In this case, it's just, it's just a question of laundry and tall tales. It's everything is much punier, is much smaller, is much less inspiring. And I think, I don't know, but I can't help but read in this poem about a man's lies and adultery. I can't help but read in her choice to, in her choice of malediction for a poet to write a sort of mock epic parody, a copy, which is to say, the whole story, the whole shtick, the whole cheating man lies to wife routine is, of course, a big fucking cliche. It has been done before. There is nothing new or interesting about it. So, being, it's a tiny and, as I said, really ingeniously constructed little parody poem. But I think that the very deflation that one feels in, the echo of, Yeats's poem reduced to, was there another wife for him to spurn? I think that very deflation is, in fact, the sort of the poem's parting go fuck yourself to the ex-husband. I'm going to break off there because I do, there's one last malediction I want to share. And I'll get to that after a break. But again, there's a lot to... I think I may end up doing another episode at some point about maledictions because there's just so much to talk about. But it is very late. I have a whole other fucking episode to put together this week. And I still have, as I said, one more... and this is worth sticking around for. There's a reason I'm going to close with this one. So just hold on tight. At some point in high school, I learned a intro to bio level explanation of the way that neurons function. And I liked it so much that I have since refused to improve my understanding of the subject just because I think it's such a handy analogy. So as I understood it in high school, neurons, nerve cells, that is, sit separated from one another by these little gaps. These gaps are called synapses. But there's, the synapse is a place where there is no nerve cell. And so something curious has to happen in order for one nerve cell to convey a message to another nerve cell. Now, the message these nerve cells convey is an electrical pulse. And a pulse will travel from one nerve cell to another, to another, to another, to another, to another. And it travels by way of these arms that extend from the nucleus of the cell. And these arms are called axons and dendrites. And the gap, the synapse, occurs between the end of an axon and the beginning of a dendrite. There's this void. And of course, because the electricity needs some kind of conductor to pass, across that void, and there's nothing there to serve, the electrical pulse actually stops at the end of the axon. And instead of electricity, the little arm of the nerve cell releases this little packet of chemicals. that we call neurotransmitters, one kind or another. And neurotransmitters pass across this little gap, the synapse, and they land on the other side. The dendrite receives them, and in response, it sends an electrical pulse on. And so the electrical pulse actually does not travel from neuron to neuron. It's a different electrical pulse, I guess you could say in one sense. And instead, the neurotransmitters make the next nerve cell respond to the one before in such a way as to recreate that electrical pulse, so to speak. Now, as I said, that is a freshman year of high school level understanding of how neurons work, and I certainly don't encourage you to apply that account anywhere beyond this podcast. But what I like about it so much is that synapse, the gap between neurons, is not so much unlike the gap between one mind and another. There is no direct conductor that travels from one of our minds to another mind. And so we need neurotransmitters. We need something that is not itself the charge. It does not carry the electrical charge, but what it does is it provokes the charge so that in the next mind, the same pulse can appear that was in the originating mind, even though between those two minds, there's this void where no electricity is conducted. And, I think fairly obviously what I'm talking about here when I talk about neurotransmitters is not just words generally, but specifically the lyric, right? And I guess I use lyric in both a more specialized and a more general sense. But I really mean, a poem whose job it is to bring about in a reader's mind a feeling that originated in the writer's mind. And the poem I've saved for last this week, I think is a really good neurotransmitter, to put it nerdily. This poem is called "To Whoever Set My Truck on Fire." It's by Steve Scafidi. It was collected in his book Sparks from a 9-Pound Hammer, which came out, I think, originally 94, maybe. I think that's right. So I'm going to say a few things before reading it, because this is a little longer than most of the poems I tend to read, and so I'll probably just read it the once. This is a poem written in a somewhat rhythmic but basically free verse. The long, more or less unbroken stream of thought is separated into 5-line semi-stanzas, I guess you could say. There is a pretty insistent anapestic foot to this poem, which we tend to associate with lullabies, sort of soporific music, and there is a dreamy, oddly soothing quality to the cadence of this poem, which I think Steve Scavidi uses to good effect. We've talked already this week about maledictions turning from one perspective to another. This one has, I think, a not entirely unforeseeable turn to it, but it's not a simple turn. And I think one of the very nice tricks that he pulls along the way in order to stir in us some of the feeling that presumably inspired the poem is that he takes some time to make fun of himself. He really takes some time to allow us to see him at a distance in this sort of clownish, pitiful predicament, so that we can get a taste not just of how angry the original offense of the truck made him feel, but but also how humiliating it was for him. He lets us see him as a comic figure in the midst of all this. I think that adds a little extra. That adds a little extra bite to the long and tantalizing warm up that leads to this poem's final delicious payoff. I won't say a whole lot else except to say that he is very much following in Horace's footsteps with his sort of winding malediction, and that though I'm really skeptical of biographical readings of poems, I try as much as possible to stay away from that and to try to take the poem on its own terms. I'll say, just because I don't have to be responsible here, because this is just a fucking podcast, that it's just a little bit more satisfying when you read this poem to know that yes, Steve Scafidi did have a truck, and yes, somebody did set it on fire, and no, the arsonist was never caught. So with all that in mind, then, this is To Whoever Set My Truck on Fire by Steve Scafidi. But let us be friends a while, and understand our differences are small, and that they float like dust in sunny rooms, and let us settle into the good work of being strangers, simply who have something to say in the middle of the night. For you have said something that interests me. Something of flames, footsteps, and the hard, heavy charge of an engine gunning away into the June cool of 4 a.m. here in West Virginia, where, last night, I woke to the sound of a door slamming, 5 or 6 fading footsteps, and through the window saw my impossible truck, bright orange like a maverick sun, and ran, I did, panicked in my underwear, bobbling the dumb extinguisher, too complex it seemed for putting out fires, and so grabbed a skillet, and jumped about like one needing to piss, while the faucet, like honey, issued its slow, sweet water, and you, I noticed, then, were watching from your idling car, far enough away I could not make your plate number, but you could see me, half naked, figuring out the puzzle of a fire 30 seconds from a dream never to be remembered, while the local chaos of a growing fire crackled through the books and boots burning in my truck. You bastard, you watched as I sprayed finally the flames with a garden hose under the moon, and yes, I cut what was surely a ridiculous figure there, and worsened it later that morning after the bored police drove home lazily, and I stalked the road in front of my house with an axe in my hand, and walked into the road after every car to memorize the plates of who might have done this. LB7329, NT7663, and you may have passed by. I don't know. You may have passed by as I committed the innocent numbers of neighbors to memory, and maybe you were miles away, and I, like the woodsman of fairy tales, threatened all with my bright axe shining with the evil joy of vengeance and mad hunger to bring harm, heavy harm, to the coward who did this. And if I find you, my friend, I promise you, I will lay the sharp blade deep into your body until the humid grabbing hands of what must be death have mercy and take you away from the constant murderous swinging my mind makes, my words make, swinging down on your body, and may your children weep 1,000 tears at your small and bewildered grave. And the poem ends with the first and only period Scafidi uses in this one. I really enjoy this poem. There's some nice little sort of expressionist touches. The water dripping like slow honey from the faucet. The bored police driving home lazily. And it's such a sadistic and yet fitting conclusion. Those children weeping at their parents' bewildered grave. So, this, like so much of what we talked about today, is a furious and vicious poem. But I think because it's so specific and because of the both horrifying and comical occasion of its composition, and just the wonderful momentum he builds up over the course of this slow, satisfying curve. This is a keeper. This is one I've come back to. So I'm gonna end here for today. That was To Whoever Set My Truck on Fire by Steve Scafidi. And this is Slee Ricketts. Thank you for listening. Please do take a moment to subscribe. If you like what you hear, give the show a rating or review on iTunes. That always helps. Or just recommend it to a friend if you think you know somebody who might like it. I did, by the way, since I last recorded earlier, the section you heard just moments before, I did go ahead and record the interview that I mentioned. I think it went well, and I'm going to have a really good, I think, fun episode with a special guest coming up for you very, very soon. Till then.